Imagine stepping out of your comfortable life for a moment and walking into a world where a single long winter could change the fate of entire villages, where the bite of cold and the scarcity of food were as dangerous as any invading army, and where every household measured its success not by possessions but by how many more winters it could survive. Picture the flaring breath of a child in the doorway, the soot-blackened faces of neighbors gathering around a sputtering hearth, the hush that falls when the wind tears at the thatch and the trees groan under the weight of ice. This is not a fairy tale. This is the reality that shaped generations in medieval Europe, a reality that forged resilient people whose lives and choices still offer wisdom for our time. Welcome to Wisdom Over Power. If you already find meaning in stories that teach life through the past, subscribe now to join a growing community that learns from history's hardest lessons. Hit subscribe so you won't miss future journeys into the human stories beneath the dates and the dust. Stay with me until the end of this long telling, because the most intimate lessons often arrive in the quiet after the storm. The winters I want you to imagine were not neat, frozen pictures. They were sprawling, messy, often lethal stretches of months where everything that sustained life, food, shelter, community, was tested again and again. In a world without insulated walls, without regulated heating, without reliable medical care, the cold invaded the body slowly and then all at once. Smoke-filled rooms tried to fend it off, but smoke and damp made people sick in ways they did not yet understand. The very fabric of society tightened under strain. Where summers allowed abundance, winter exposed vulnerability. Where communities were close-knit, winter's pressure revealed the strength of those ties. Where bonds were brittle, harsh seasons could break them. Imagine a peasant waking before dawn in a single-room cottage, the mattress a heap of straw, the air wet with smoke, the small children still asleep, breathing shallow clouds that drift into the dim. The farmer rises, pulls his thin woolen cloak round his shoulders, and checks the last sack of grain. The grain has to last until the day when the fields can be plowed again, when the soil is forgiving and the seed can be sown. Until then, there are soups boiled from dried peas and the occasional sliver of salted pork, meals measured not by taste but by necessity. The fire smolders and smoke curls from the chimney. Chopping more wood becomes not a chore but a desperate calculation. Walk out into the yard and see the animals curled into themselves, breath steaming like small impossible clouds. If the animals die, the household loses meat, milk, power to plow, and traction across the seasons. With every frost, risk piles on risk. Now picture a lord in a great stone hall. The tapestries hang heavy, and the hearth in the great fireplace gulps in tons of wood yet still leaves a chill in the stone air. Servants carry hot dishes and warm wine, but even they dream of spring. The Lord worries about stores and about obligations. Tithes, rents, obligations to soldiers and retainers. In winter, responsibilities become heavier, and the difference between wealth and poverty narrows in the face of frost. A single winter can make a treasury strain, and a single bad harvest can change the political weight of a noble house. Winter is an equalizer in the hardest sense. It reveals how fragile any claim to comfort can be. Communities developed 1,000 adaptations, and each small survival strategy was a form of wisdom passed down in 1,000 different words and gestures. Food preservation mattered. People smoked and salted meat, dried fruits, and salted fish, and stored grain in communal granaries. They developed social norms for sharing and mutual aid because if a neighbor starved, the neighborhood's stability also crumbled. Common rights to gather dead wood, to glean stubble left in fields after the harvest, to fish in communal ponds. These were not mere conveniences. They were essential contingency plans. Seasonal labor patterns shifted. Winter tasks moved indoors to weaving, mending, and crafting, things that kept hands busy and communities afloat. The rituals and festivals of midwinter, whether full of misrule and song or quiet with prayer, were not frivolous. They were the psychological architecture that kept hope alive, that reminded people that even the bleakest season was part of a larger cycle. Disease walked hand in hand with winter. Close quarters allowed a cough to sweep through a household, and a cough to spread through a village. In cramped smoky rooms where people slept shoulder to shoulder with animals to share warmth, an infection spread like a thin, hungry shadow. Malnutrition from poor winter diets made bodies less able to fight off simple infections. A child with a cough might mean a household with less labor. A coughing parent might mean the harvesting tools fall unused when spring finally comes. Catastrophes magnified other catastrophes. A bad winter could prime an already strained population for a terrible plague. Disease did not need snow or blizzard to be devastating, but winter made it easier for germs and misery to take hold. Yet even then, human kindness again showed itself. Monasteries opened their doors. Neighbors pooled what they had. Those acts of generosity, small, quiet, and dangerous in their own way, saved lives. There were also the winters that became turning points in history. When rivers froze and towns found their trade routes choked with ice, supply chains failed. Kings and councils realized that logistics in a cold season were not trivial matters of comfort, but matters of survival and sovereignty. Armies that attempted campaigns in winter discovered how suddenly mobility could fail. Horses, cloven hooves, carts bogging in mud, all of it rendered movement perilous and unpredictable. Winter favored those who knew their terrain, who could live off the land, who understood the cunning of weather as an ally or an enemy. In some accounts of battles in frozen and mountainous passes, weather was the decisive commander, turning an otherwise superior force into a routed, freezing mass. The environment was its own general, indifferent and relentless. Yet there were human responses that were unexpected and creative. The festival day that inverted authority, the appointed moment when a peasant could be lord for a day, gave people a psychological release valve. For that day, laughter could loosen the constant grind of worry. Shared songs, mummers' plays, dice games, and communal feasting built social capital that repaid itself in times of need. These rituals were acts of cultural engineering. They reasserted community bonds, reminded people of their shared fate, and gave them practice in generosity and mutual obligation. The culture of giving, public alms, charitable kitchens run by religious houses, and grain distributions, helped hold societies together when scarcity threatened to smash human compassion into selfishness. The medieval idea of charity as a duty was sometimes the only reason a family did not perish in winter's worst months. The human body changes under the frost, and so did human ingenuity. Clothing was layered and heavy. Homes were built with small windows and deep eaves. People slept curled together for warmth and kept animals inside near their sleeping spaces, not for affection but for survival. Architectural choices were survival strategies. Lower ceilings to keep heat focused, heavy curtains to block drafts, and in some places, shared longhouses where many households clustered for mutual warmth. Medical practice was a mix of observation and error. Treatments that now sound cruel, bloodletting, purging, came from an earnest effort to balance unseen humors. Some treatments did more harm than good, but in a time without antibiotics, the knowledge to treat wounds and blunt trauma, to set bones, and to bolster nutrition where possible still saved lives. When winter was a test, practical nursing, keeping a fevered child warm, ensuring clean bedding when possible, feeding broth, carried out in humility, was often what mattered most. Children were especially vulnerable. Infant mortality rates were tragically high. Mothers labored under physically exhausting conditions, and childbirth in a cold hut lacked the sterility and backup of later eras. Families learned to cherish survival in a way that made every newborn an act of theological and practical hope. Naming customs, godparent relationships, and village networks were all part of a practical safety net. A baby might be protected because dozens of hands felt obliged to protect that child. Those obligations kept the community alive. There were also individual stories, small beacons in a landscape of hardship. A widow who gave her cloak to a beggar and walked home shivering because the warmth of compassion was a different kind of warmth. A monk in a cold scriptorium who spent long nights copying texts, preserving knowledge, and offering a hot bowl of broth to a shivering traveler who could not pay. A royal who burned more timber than prudence might allow in the effort to hold a court together through the bleak months, a gesture of prestige that also reflected genuine human anxiety about the king's ability to protect his people. These stories are not merely quaint. They teach a central lesson. In dire times, moral courage is as essential as physical preparation. A generous act is an investment not only in the suffering neighbor but in the social fabric that keeps everyone tethered to a future. Food itself tells a story of ingenuity and compromise. Preservation techniques, smoking, salting, fermenting, drying, were not merely culinary experiments but survival technologies. Pottages, stews, and gruels made use of what remained, combining root vegetables, salted meat, barley, and whatever greens could be foraged under the snow. The diet was monotonous and seldom delicious by modern standards, but it was sufficient to keep bodies working until the plow could be turned again. When the harvest failed, people scavenged tree bark, boiled leather for its small nourishment, and resorted to foraging in desperate circumstances. The ugly truths we barely whisper about, cannibalism in the worst famines, mass graves in the spring thaw, are an indictment of the terrifying power of starvation. At the same time, the everyday acts of saving seed, storing grain in raised bins, and pooling harvests across kin networks are quiet miracles of collective thinking in the face of scarcity. Religion and spirituality also shaped the winter experience. For many, faith was practical. Prayers were petitions for weather, for the health of livestock, and for the safety of loved ones. Rituals took on a heightened importance when the world felt arbitrary. Pilgrimages, though dangerous in winter, were undertaken to ask for miracles when medicine and food failed. Church calendars provided both rhythm and refuge. Monasteries supplied charity and rudimentary medical care, while parish priests visited the sick, administered rites, and offered words that steadied many hearts. The relationship between religious duty and social welfare was entangled. Theology encouraged charity, and charity kept the social order operating when risk was highest. Whether sincere belief or social tool, religious practice shaped behavior that literally kept people alive. From an ecological perspective, winters also reshaped landscapes and livelihoods. Rivers closed for navigation, frozen over like bridges of glass. Marshes and tidal plains, suddenly transformed by storms and ice, could drown communities in a single event. In contrast, sometimes the freeze enabled winter fairs and winter markets on frozen waterways. Economic adaptations turned into social life. The weather was capricious. In some years, fishermen could walk on ice and trade in the very center of a frozen river. In others, storms removed centuries of coastline in a night. Communities that survived were those that learned redundancy, multiple food sources, diversified labor, and a social fabric capable of reallocating resources during crisis. And yet, embedded in all of this winter hardship was an ever-present thread of hope, the promise of thaw. The ritual of Plough Monday, the first communal push back at the season, when the plough was blessed and the village mobilized to re-enter the soil, was not just agricultural. It was a public recommitment to the future. The first crocus pushing through the thawed earth was not trivial. It was proof that the long winter had not won. The return of migratory birds, the sound of frogs in thawing ditches, all were the small celebrations of life's persistence that people measured with acutely grateful hearts. The festival of returning life, the singing and dancing, the noisy reconnection with the physical work of tilling, was a catharsis after months of holding breath. To stand in a furrow and watch the soil tilt was to witness a promise kept. When you step back, these winters teach a broader lesson about human adaptation. Hardship does not produce a single response. It spawns systems, from the mundane to the sublime. Storage barns that feed many, public kitchens that feed the hungry, festivals that sustain morale, laws that regulate common rights, narratives that immortalize acts of generosity, medical practices that, however primitive, evolve into better responses, and leadership choices that bear on community survival. The medieval world shows us that resilience is both technical and moral. It is about having the barns and granaries, and about being willing to open them when the need is greatest. In our modern frame, we sometimes forget the skeletal simplicity of survival. We assume that comfort is a right, rather than a fragile achievement built on many small competencies. But when we face our own winters, economic downturns, health crises, isolation, the same principles apply. Practical preparedness matters. Systems that diversify risk and mutual assistance arrangements that ensure no one falls between the cracks. Moral courage matters. Leaders who use resources to protect the vulnerable, neighbors who step forward to share warmth. Psychological resilience matters. Cultural practices that give people reasons to hope, laugh, and connect when everything presses inwards. So let me ask you now, in the quiet after this long telling, when you face the winters of your life, what will your response be? Will you hunker down and guard what is yours? Or will you share and risk comfort in order to maintain the web of mutual aid that might save you tomorrow? Will you be a steward of resources, building redundancy and relationships, or will you trust in brittle systems that fracture under stress? History does not lecture us in tidy morals. It offers templates, bruised, complex, human templates, that we can examine and adapt. There is no single heroic formula. Survival favored communities that combined prudence, generosity, and stubborn hope. If this journey through the cold has stirred something in you, or led you to remember a family story about endurance, tell it in the comments. I read what you write, and the conversation here builds into the same kind of community that sustained people through their hardest seasons. Like this video if the story moved you, and subscribe to Wisdom Over Power if you want more long-form explorations into the lives that shaped our world and the practical wisdom they left behind. Share this with a friend who appreciates deep historical storytelling, because these lessons are most powerful when they travel beyond one solitary listener. Before we close, consider these questions and bring them into the comment thread. If you had lived in a medieval village, what would you have done to survive? What skills would you have learned? And what role would you have taken in your community? Which story of resilience from this telling speaks to you most? And why? And finally, what is the winter you face today, not in weather but in life? And what is one small act of generosity or preparation you can take right now to help both yourself and someone else? Your answers will not be trivial. They are the seeds of solidarity that keep human communities thriving. Thank you for spending this long time with me in the company of ancestors who faced winter and kept faith with tomorrow. May you carry their stubborn hope into your own life. Subscribe to Wisdom Over Power to continue exploring the lessons of the past. Hit like if this resonated, and leave a comment so we can keep the conversation alive. Until next time, stay warm in heart and mind, and remember that even the longest night yields, at last, to the return of light. Good night.